Hello and welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Kaveh Tafai. Syria is now in a full-scale civil war. UN peacekeeping chief Hervé Letsous has said. Syria says what's going on is not a civil war, but Syria fighting armed terrorists, in which Russia has accused outside elements of arming these armed terrorists. Meanwhile, the United States has accused Russia of supplying arms to the government of President Bashar al-Assad. Is it any wonder why joint UN Arab League envoy Kofi Annan's six-point peace plan has failed, one which all sides have said they're committed to? In this news analysis, we'll be discussing Syria and the roles of different countries to get a sense of what's really occurring on the ground.
Official and public reactions to the Arab League's stance toward the Syrian media continue across the country. The Arab League called on both the Nilesat and Arabsat to halt the transmission of Syrian TV channels, particularly the official Syrian state TV, Ad-Dunya TV and Al-Ikhbariya. Syrian members of the parliament say the move has aimed to stop the coverage of the events happening in Syria and the real truth behind them.
Syrian channels speak about the truth of events in Syria and unveil the lies of some Western and Arab TV channels that falsify the facts about the reality on the ground. And because Syrian channels have credibility, they are targeted. Such a demand by the Arab League is part of a plot against Syria.
Analysts say the Arab League's call is widely influenced by some Western states.
The US, Israel, and some states that claim to be democratic are the ones who asked some Arab countries and the Arab League to call for stopping Syrian channels transmission. These Western states are actually taking the decisions because they literally control some Arab states' officials.
The Ministry of Information in a statement said the demand is part of a media campaign against Syria, which has been launched by some Arab states that are controlled by the West. Another statement also pointed out that those seeking the elimination of Syrian media platforms are the armed group's partners who want to get rid of anyone who speaks about the terrorists' acts in Syria. Freedom of expression, a main right countries of the world seek to preserve and call for. However, analysts say the Arab League, by calling for stopping the Syrian channel's transmission, it is violating this basic right of expression. Hamad Ali, Press TV, Damascus.
Let's discuss this with our guests. Let me introduce them. From the Syrian Social Club, we have Amar Waqaf, who joins us from London. From the Executive Intelligence Review, Bill Jones joins us from Washington, and Director of the Center for Research on Globalization, Professor Michel Chossudovsky, joins us from Montreal. Gentlemen, welcome. Professor Chossudovsky, I'm going to start first with you. In her press conference on Monday, the U.S. State Department spokeswoman Victoria Nuland predicted that there would be at least 3 more new massacres in Syria, like the one in Houla. She knew the specific locations of these would-be massacres. At the same time, there was the Israeli Deputy Minister Ayub Kara, who said Syria might use its chemical weapons against Israeli forces. What do you make of these comments?
Well, I'm not surprised because the evidence increasingly points to the involvement of U.S. intelligence and the U.S. military in supporting directly the death squads, namely the atrocities which were committed in Houla were committed, and this is confirmed by many independent reports, were committed by the Free Syrian Army, the self-proclaimed Free Syrian Army, which is supported by the United States and the Western Military Alliance. So that if she made that statement, well, perhaps she had some advanced indication of the covert operations in support of these death squads. We're dealing with a diabolical agenda whereby the United States supporting terrorist entities which have been active in Syria right from day one, in Dara in March of last year. They support these terrorist entities which are involved in acts of killing civilians, and then they blame the killings on the enemy, namely on the Syrian government. I should mention, and it's very important, that this notion of a massive casualty-producing event used for propaganda purposes, namely killing civilians, is something which is entrenched in U.S. military doctrine since the 1960s. It was part of a secret operation, Operation Northwoods, which in principle was directed against Cuba, and that operation is clear, crystal clear, because it has been declassified. And what it consisted in, and I quote from the document, plans to kill innocent people and commit acts of terrorism in the United States with a view to creating a useful wave of indignation in U.S. newspapers and then blaming it on Fidel Castro. Okay? So that was a 1962 op. President Kennedy refused to implement it, but it is something which they have been doing, killing people and then blaming it on the enemy, and then using the killing to justify a military agenda, namely, in this case, aggression against a sovereign country.
Let's look at, Amar Waqaf, what the report was focused on, and that was in terms of the decision by the Arab League to have Syrian TV stop its broadcast on these two satellite channels, Nilesat and Arabsat, in which it said that it was perhaps an indication that the Arab League was influenced by some Western countries. Why do you think a decision like that was made?
Well, if you go, very far away in fabricating things that are happening on the ground, it's not only enough for the Syrian people to know exactly what is happening, but when Syrian television and Syrian satellite channels, show that certain realities on the ground, then the surrounding environment, the Arab world or the Western environment, should not really know what is really happening. So, for example, Syrian television has been for the past few weeks showing certain videos, unedited videos that were captured after an operation of the Syrian army in Bab Amr in Homs. And those edited videos reveal that the culprits of the videos we had seen before on YouTube claiming that the Syrian army is doing this atrocity or committing that atrocity, when you see the unedited video, which is like 10 times longer, you see that the armed groups are the ones who are actually doing this, and they are, quite happy about doing it. They shout Allahu Akbar and then they laugh. But when you have the video on YouTube, the laughing is cut, for example. The Arab world should not really see these things, because they should not question the story that has been presented to them from the very beginning by the likes of Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. That's why they wanted to shut down the Syrian satellite TV channels. And again, there are now indications that a new chapter of the propaganda is going to take place, which is, about inciting a full-scale civil war in Syria. Now, if Syrian television comes out and says, well, this is exactly what happened in Houla, this is exactly what happened in this area where an alleged massacre was committed by the Syrian army, then the people outside Syria won't believe everything that is being said, and especially the people in Syria, because a lot of Syrians watch Syrian satellite channel in their houses, and if that is cut, then probably they won't be able to see much of this truth coming out. It's pretty much a similar situation to what happened with Press TV itself here in London. Suddenly it was cut off the air for whatever reason. People, the target audience should not see what these channels are going to say.
Bill Jones, NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen made an interesting comparison between the unrest in Syria. It was to the wars in the Balkans back in the 1990s. What do you read between the lines from his comments there?
Well, I think it's clear that there are certain elements who really want military intervention in Syria. This is coming out of the British circles, the British French circles, the same ones who were pushing the Libya operation, want to destabilize Syria for a variety of reasons, to undercut the relationship of Syria with Iran, but also to destabilize and to weaken Russia and China, which of course Russia in particular has probably been the prime force that has prevented a war in Syria. And Obama is really there's a big fight within Washington on this issue. Susan Rice out of the embassy in the UN and people around Obama in the White House, Tom Donilon and others, are really pushing for a military option, but there's still opposition to that being placed up by the U.S. military, by General Dempsey, who most recently gave a press conference last week saying he did not want a military intervention in Syria. He wanted a diplomatic solution. But there is a tremendous push now to move in that direction, to destabilize the Middle East, and really to upset the positions taken by China and Russia, which is kind of the bigger picture going on here.
Professor Chossudovsky, when our guest there talks about how Russia and China is the bigger picture, let's reflect on your statements here. You said the U.S. military and the U.S. intelligence are supporting the death squads. Now, there's a big difference between the U.S. military and the U.S. intelligence in terms of their support. Elaborate on that more for us, and ultimately clarify for us, is the U.S. arming the opposition or the armed groups inside Syria? Of which then, if that's the case, we're looking at these countries, including the U.S., which in essence then are fighting Assad and his security apparatus, who's being armed by Russia, of which the Apache helicopters Russia denied.
Well, let me clarify a little bit the issue of the relationship between the Pentagon and the CIA. As you may notice, the CIA director is appointed to the Pentagon, and then you have a senior, I'm thinking of General Porteous, who is then appointed to the CIA. There's a lot of competition between the two, but there's a lot of collaboration, and ultimately they consult and they see eye to eye, and then they coordinate with the State Department. Now, on the second part of your question, the action, covert action within Syrian territory has been there right from the beginning. The United States and NATO are supporting the terrorists. And this was actually even revealed in the Israeli media right at the beginning. There was a report to the effect that actually NATO was recruiting the Mujahideen, in other words, fundamentalist fighters, to integrate their foot soldiers in Syria. We know that there are special forces on the ground from NATO countries. Recently we had a situation where French parachutists, French special forces, were repatriated to France, an agreement between Damascus and Paris just before the French elections. There's British MI6 on the ground. In other words, the war has already started. This is a war of aggression. It is not necessarily using the instruments of conventional theater wars, which is to come in with artillery and air force and so on, but Allied special forces on the ground. They are training the rebels. They are also training the rebels in the art of committing atrocities. And what is very important is that the death squads which were created in Iraq in 2005 under the helm of John Negroponte, who was ambassador at the time, and this was based on the Salvador option. In other words, creating death squadrons, and then these death squads go in and kill people, which then creates the situation of sectarian warfare. Well, the current, or the outgoing, if you wish, ambassador to Damascus, U.S. ambassador to Syria, Robert Stephen Ford, was part of the Negroponte team in Baghdad in 2005, and what is involved is the formation of killers, of actual killers which go in, kill people, and they're killing people also in the Christian community, which is confirmed by Vatican sources, and then they use this to create sectarian violence and to lead to the demise of the government. That is what is happening. So the war has started. This is not a civil war. This is a war of aggression against a sovereign state.
And again, to get this clear, it seems like a perfect scenario for these countries like the United States and the Arab countries, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, to name a few here, since they're the ones arming the opposition, whether it's through weapons or through intelligence. Then on the other side, you have Russia, that has given military support for the Assad security apparatus. So in essence, there are no soldiers that are on the ground from the United States or from these Arab countries. Am I correct to conclude that? Fighting against each other?
There have been no confirmation of U.S. soldiers on the ground, but there have been confirmation of British, French, Qatari special forces on the ground. And there are indications that the United States is actually involved in the training of terrorists out of military facilities in Qatar.
Okay, let's move on to another question here, Amar Waqaf. This is a false flag operation in which the Syrian armed groups tried to set up British journalists working for Channel 4 reporter Alex Thompson and to get him killed in anti-President Assad propaganda. You might be aware of this. Thompson said that his deaths at the hands of President Bashar al-Assad's forces would have drawn sympathy to the rebel cause. Dead journalists are bad for Damascus, he said. Wasn't this the same scenario that happened in Houla?
Well, what we know of what happened in Houla right now is that officially the two families that were slain in Al-Houla were actually pro-government. One of them is related to the newly elected MP of the region, Mr. Abdul Mu'ti al-Mushlib, the two families of Al-Sayyid and Abdul Razzaq. What the German newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, claimed, and this is yet to be confirmed, is that the two families were actually Shiite and Alawite families, and the only Sunni family is the tiny one that is related to this newly MP. And if this is true, then this blows the whole theory upon which the Syrian diplomats were expelled from Europe, from Canada, from Australia, because it is very clear that the Syrian army, A, did not commit this atrocity by shelling, because we never saw any body being, dragged from under the rubble. All the bodies that we saw, especially of those of the children, were actually killed in cold blood from as a result of wounds that were sustained from very close range. And the second, if this is really confirmed that these families were not Sunni Syrians, then it's very probably clear who actually committed this. Now, I mean, anybody can ask the question: why would the Shabiha, as it was then claimed, take on an entire village and only choose a few houses in which very related families live? If they were there to kill based on sectarian basis, they would actually kill everybody they see in front of them. Why choose a certain family? It's only when we realize that those families were pro-government, then we know what really happened, and it was indeed the armed groups who committed this. Now, there is this game that is going on all the time, which you referred to with regards to the Channel 4 correspondent, which is, we do something and immediately blame the Syrian government. The supporting governments of the West, the United States and Europe and so on, take certain steps. Let's let the Security Council convene, let us increase the sanctions and so on and so forth. And later on, when the dust settles and the reality is clear, nobody gives a damn anymore. So this has been a trend since the very beginning, really. It's not new at all.
Bill Jones, that's a very dangerous trend, isn't it? When the dust settles and the reality comes out, it's no longer important. But the audience around the world who's following this, obviously it seems that they have to read between the lines. I mean, as an example, this is a reputable news wire agency. This is how they've reported one example. They cited accounts of security forces using precise shelling to hit opposition strongholds in residential areas. I repeat, residential areas where they were hiding. Now, doesn't that translate into the opposition using these people as human shields?
Well, we have a lot of examples of this type of thing, including, as Foreign Minister Lavrov said in his recent press conference, of how many of these people took the journalist or pointed the journalist in a certain direction, knowing that they were going to get attacked, hoping that they could have the bodies of dead journalists that they could show the world and saying, you know, this is the result of the Syrian military. I mean, this is what you've had going on, this kind of counterinsurgency operations on the part of the Syrian Liberation Army and the other forces, diverse forces which are operating within Syria, in order to create the kind of Goebbels propaganda which is needed in order to appease world opinion, in order to create some kind of a military action against Syria. It all began with Libya. There was an attempt to make a domino effect of this sort of thing, to go from Libya to go to Syria. In the light of what is the biggest financial crisis in the world, a lot of things are very, very unstable, and they wanted to create a situation in which there was greater control. And I think in the backs of people's minds, this destabilization is not simply aimed at President Assad or even at Iran, but it's really to undermine the role that China and Russia have been playing as major powers in trying to maintain stability in the world. And if Syria is gone, then of course Russia loses a major ally. And of course they also, since they've taken the point in trying to defend the sovereignty of Syria, they also are significantly weakened by the fact that their policies have been defeated. So there is a greater game being played here, and the fact that it hasn't occurred yet is due to the resistance that has been put up by President Putin and his people in Russia, but also by a certain reticence here in the United States, where there's kind of a fight behind the scenes in preventing any kind of U.S. military action in Syria. The U.S. military is very much overstressed at this point. They want to move more into Asia. A new war in the Middle East would change that entirely. And that's why there's a lot of resistance to this coming from the uniformed military. But on the civilian side, this is being pushed by Rice, by people in the White House, Tom Donilon, and by the Obama people.
Okay, well, finally, let me go to you, Professor Chossudovsky. Tell us where the situation is headed, given all the different dynamics, given all the different statements coming out, like the UN saying it's a civil war, the opposition coming out saying it's not a civil war, et cetera, et cetera. Where is this heading to? Quickly, if you can.
Well, I think if we want to look at the broader picture, we have to address the fact that a war on Syria, which in some respects has already commenced, how it will unwind is another matter, is part of a global agenda. It does, in a very direct way, affect the relationship between the United States and its allies and the two competing world powers, namely China and Russia. It is not coincidental that the United States is threatening China in the South China Sea, in the Korean Peninsula, and is also threatening Russia on its European borders. These threats are there to, in a sense, to convince the Russians and the Chinese that they should toe the line. It's a blackmailing process. But I should emphasize that if any kind of broader military action were to take place against Syria, this could lead to escalation and become a regional war, which would extend from the eastern Mediterranean right through to Central Asia and the western frontier with.
Okay, thank you. We're going to leave it there. Let me thank our guest, Syrian Social Club, Ammar Waqaf there from London, from the Executive Intelligence Review, Bill Jones. Thank you so much. And Director of the Center for Research on Globalization, Professor Michel Chossudovsky from Montreal. Thank you for watching another edition. Any questions or comments, newsroom@presstv.r is our email address. From Miko Vetarway and the entire team, it's goodbye.